The mission that changed everything. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Afghan mountains as Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison adjusted his tactical gear one final time. The intelligence briefing had been clear. A high-value target was hiding in a remote compound, and his SEAL team had been tasked with bringing him in alive. What the briefing hadn't mentioned was how quickly everything could go wrong in the unforgiving terrain of Helmand Province. Morrison's team consisted of 8 highly trained operators, each with years of combat experience under their belts.
Petty Officer First Class. Marcus Chen handled communications, his steady voice a constant reassurance during the most chaotic moments.
Senior Chief Danny Rodriguez served as the team's demolitions expert, his calm demeanor hiding an explosive personality when the situation demanded it. The youngest member, Petty Officer Second Class Tommy Williams, had joined the team just 6 months ago, but his marksmanship skills had already earned him the respect of his seasoned teammates. The helicopter insertion had gone smoothly, with the team fast-roping into a valley 3 kilometers from their target. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, with rocky outcroppings and sparse vegetation offering limited cover. As they moved through the pre-dawn darkness, each man knew that they were entering territory where the enemy had every advantage. The Taliban fighters knew these mountains like their own backyard, and they had been preparing for exactly this kind of assault for months. Intelligence reports had indicated minimal resistance at the compound, but Morrison had learned long ago never to trust intelligence completely. His instincts told him something was off about this mission from the start. The target's location had been too easy to obtain, the compound's defenses seemed surprisingly light, and the local chatter intercepted by their analysts had been suspiciously quiet. Despite these concerns, the mission parameters were clear, and Morrison trusted his team's ability to adapt to whatever challenges they might face. As they approached the compound in the early morning hours, the team moved with practiced precision. Each operator knew his role perfectly. Rodriguez would breach the main entrance. Chen would establish communications and coordinate with headquarters. Williams would provide overwatch from an elevated position, and Morrison would lead the assault team through the compound's interior. The plan was textbook perfect, rehearsed dozens of times in training facilities back home. The compound sat on a small plateau, surrounded by steep rocky walls that formed a natural fortress. A single dirt road wound up the mountainside, offering the only vehicular access to the target location. The building itself was a traditional Afghan structure, with thick mud brick walls and a flat roof that would provide excellent defensive positions for anyone inside. Small windows dotted the walls, each one a potential firing port for defenders. As the team moved into position, Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The silence was too complete, the absence of any human activity too perfect for a location that should have shown signs of occupation. Through his night vision goggles, he scanned the surrounding ridgelines, looking for any sign of movement or the telltale glint of optical equipment. Everything appeared normal, but his combat experience had taught him to trust his instincts above all else. The breach went exactly as planned. Rodriguez's explosive charges blew the heavy wooden door off its hinges, and the team flowed into the compound with practiced efficiency. Room by room, they cleared the structure, finding evidence of recent occupation but no sign of their target. Empty tea glasses still held warmth, indicating that the compound's inhabitants had left only hours before their arrival. It was Williams who first spotted the problem. From his overwatch position on a nearby ridge, he had a commanding view of the surrounding terrain. Through his scope, he began to notice movement in the rocks above their position. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than shadows cast by the rising sun, but as he focused his attention, the shadows began to take on human forms. Dozens of fighters were moving into position around the compound, carrying weapons and equipment that indicated they had been planning this ambush for some time. The realization hit Morrison like a physical blow. They hadn't been hunting their target. They had been led into a carefully prepared trap. The high-value target had never been in the compound at all. Instead, the intelligence had been deliberately leaked to draw his team into a location where they could be surrounded and eliminated. The Taliban fighters had turned the natural fortress that protected the compound into a prison that would trap the SEALs in a killing field with no escape. Root, Chen's radio crackled with urgent reports. From their overwatch position, Williams had counted at least 50 enemy fighters moving into position, with more arriving every minute. Heavy weapons were being positioned on the surrounding ridges, creating overlapping fields of fire that would make any escape attempt suicidal. The single road that had provided their approach route was now blocked by fighters with rocket-propelled grenades and machine guns. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the scope of their predicament became clear. The SEALs found themselves trapped in a compound with limited ammunition, no reinforcements immediately available, and an enemy force that outnumbered them by at least 6-1. The nearest friendly forces were hours away, and any helicopter extraction would be impossible until the surrounding high ground could be secured. Morrison gathered his team in the compound's central courtyard, using hand signals to communicate their situation. Each man understood the gravity of their circumstances without needing detailed explanations. They had walked into the enemy's trap, and now they would have to fight their way out or die trying. The thick walls that had initially seemed like protection now felt more like the walls of a tomb. The first enemy shots rang out just as Morrison finished positioning his men for defense. Bullets struck the compound's walls with deadly precision, sending chips of stone and dust flying through the air. The battle for their lives had begun, and every man knew that their survival would depend on their training, their brotherhood, and perhaps a miracle they couldn't yet imagine. Under siege, the first volley of enemy fire shattered the morning silence with devastating intensity. Bullets ricocheted off the compound's stone walls, creating a deadly symphony of metal against rock that would haunt the survivors' dreams for years to come. Morrison pressed himself against the thick mud brick wall, feeling the vibrations of each impact through his body, as he tried to assess their tactical situation. From his position near the main gate, Rodriguez counted muzzle flashes from at least 12 different positions on the surrounding ridges. The enemy had chosen their firing positions with military precision, creating interlocking fields of fire that left no corner of the compound safe from their weapons. Every doorway, every window, every potential escape route was covered by at least 2 different shooters. Williams had managed to reach a defensive position on the compound's flat roof, but his situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Enemy snipers had identified his location and were systematically destroying the low wall that provided his only protection. Chunks of masonry exploded around him with each shot, forcing him to keep his head down and limiting his ability to return effective fire. Chen worked frantically with his radio equipment, trying to establish communication with their headquarters and coordinate some form of rescue operation. The mountainous terrain made radio communication difficult under normal circumstances, but the stress of combat made the technical challenges nearly insurmountable. Static filled his earpiece as he adjusted frequencies and antenna positions, searching for any signal that might connect them with the outside world. The enemy's tactics were sophisticated and well coordinated. Rather than launching a direct assault that might give the SEALs opportunities for concentrated defensive fire, the Taliban fighters were content to maintain their siege positions and wear down the Americans through attrition. They had unlimited ammunition, superior numbers, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Time was on their side, and they knew it. Morrison realized that their defensive strategy needed immediate revision. The compound's layout, which had seemed advantageous during their initial assault, was now working against them. The central courtyard that had provided easy movement between rooms was now a killing field that no one could cross safely. Each team member was effectively isolated in his defensive position, unable to support his teammates or coordinate their response to the enemy's attacks. The psychological pressure was as dangerous as the physical threat. The constant sound of gunfire, the knowledge that they were outnumbered and surrounded, and the uncertainty about rescue operations created stress levels that could break even the most experienced operators. Morrison watched his men carefully, looking for signs that the pressure was affecting their performance or decision-making abilities. Rodriguez found himself trapped in a storage room near the compound's eastern wall. Enemy fire had destroyed the doorway he had used to enter the room, and debris blocked his exit route. He could hear movement on the other side of the wall, indicating that enemy fighters were attempting to position themselves for a close-range assault. His explosives training told him exactly how to respond, but using demolitions in such close quarters would risk bringing down the entire section of the building. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and the desert heat began to add another layer of difficulty to their situation. The thick walls that provided protection from enemy fire also trapped heat inside the compound, creating an oven-like environment that sapped their strength and clouded their judgment. Dehydration became a real concern as their water supplies dwindled and sweat poured from their bodies. Williams managed to establish communication with Morrison through hand signals, reporting that he could see enemy reinforcements arriving from the north. Vehicles loaded with fighters and heavy weapons were making their way up the mountain road, bringing the total enemy force to nearly 100 fighters. The odds, which had been bad from the beginning, were becoming impossible. Chen finally managed to establish radio contact with their headquarters, but the news was not encouraging. The nearest friendly forces were engaged in their own operations and could not provide immediate assistance. Helicopter extraction was impossible due to the enemy's control of the surrounding high ground and their possession of surface-to-air missiles. The SEALs were on their own for the foreseeable future. The first enemy probe came from the compound's western wall. A small group of Taliban fighters attempted to scale the wall using ropes and grappling hooks, hoping to establish a foothold inside the compound's perimeter. Morrison and his team responded with concentrated fire, driving back the assault, but not before the enemy had identified weak points in their defensive positions. As the battle continued, ammunition became a critical concern. Each SEAL had entered the compound with a standard combat load, but sustained defensive fire was consuming their supplies at an alarming rate. Morrison made the difficult decision to implement ammunition conservation measures, allowing only aimed shots at confirmed targets. This tactical change reduced their defensive firepower, but extended their ability to continue fighting. The enemy seemed to sense their growing desperation. The volume of incoming fire increased and enemy fighters began calling out taunts in broken English, trying to demoralize the trapped Americans. They spoke of the slow death that awaited them, of the degradation their bodies would suffer in the desert heat, and of the propaganda victory their deaths would provide for the Taliban cause. Rodriguez managed to clear his blocked exit by using a small explosive charge to blow away the debris. The blast attracted intense enemy fire to his position, but it also allowed him to rejoin his teammates in the compound's central area. His expertise with explosives might prove crucial if they were forced to attempt a breakout through the enemy's positions. As afternoon approached, the tactical situation continued to deteriorate. Enemy mortar fire began falling inside the compound, forcing the SEALs to take cover in the building's interior rooms. The mortars weren't accurate enough to target individual positions, but they created psychological pressure and filled the air with deadly shrapnel that made any movement extremely dangerous. Morrison gathered intelligence from his team's observations and began to formulate desperate plans for escape. Every option carried enormous risks and minimal chances of success. A direct assault up the mountain road would expose them to concentrated enemy fire from prepared positions. Attempting to escape cross-country on foot would mean abandoning any heavy equipment and hoping to outrun enemy patrols in unfamiliar terrain. The weight of command pressed heavily on Morrison's shoulders. These men had followed him into what was supposed to be a routine operation, and now they were facing death because of intelligence failures and enemy cunning that were completely beyond their control. He knew that every decision he made in the coming hours might mean the difference between life and death for his entire team. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Morrison realized that they were running out of both time and options. The enemy was content to wait them out, knowing that darkness would give them additional advantages in any final assault. Unless something changed dramatically, the night would bring a coordinated enemy attack that his depleted team would be unable to resist. The longest day. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the compound as the siege entered its most dangerous phase. Morrison wiped sweat from his eyes and checked his watch for the 100th time. They had been trapped for over 6 hours, and each passing minute brought them closer to the inevitable night assault that would likely end their lives. The enemy's patience was infinite, but his team's resources were not. Chen had managed to maintain sporadic radio contact with headquarters, but the messages were increasingly grim. All available aircraft were committed to other operations, ground forces were engaged across the province, and the enemy's surface-to-air missiles made any immediate rescue attempt impossible. The SEALs were completely on their own, facing an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. Williams had relocated twice as enemy snipers systematically destroyed his defensive positions. His marksmanship skills had kept several enemy assaults at bay, but he was down to his last few magazines of ammunition. From his current position behind a partially collapsed wall, he could see enemy fighters moving with increasing boldness as they sensed their prey's growing weakness. The psychological warfare had intensified as the day progressed. Enemy fighters used loudspeakers to broadcast propaganda messages in English, describing in graphic detail what would happen to the Americans when they were finally captured. They spoke of torture, mutilation, and the public display of their bodies as trophies of victory. The messages were designed to break the SEALs' will to fight, but they only strengthened their resolve to die fighting rather than surrender. Rodriguez had used his demolitions expertise to create improvised defensive measures throughout the compound. Booby traps guarded potential breach points, and explosive charges were positioned to deny key areas to enemy fighters. His work had slowed the enemy's advance, but it had also consumed most of his explosive materials. The final battle, when it came, would have to be fought with small arms alone. Morrison found himself fighting not just the enemy outside the walls, but also the growing despair within his own team. Combat fatigue was setting in as adrenaline reserves were depleted, and physical exhaustion took its toll. Dehydration and heat stress were affecting reaction times and decision-making abilities. He knew that his men needed rest, but rest was a luxury they couldn't afford with death lurking just beyond their defensive perimeter. The enemy's tactical patience was masterful. Rather than waste fighters in costly frontal assaults, they had chosen to methodically tighten their grip around the compound while preserving their strength for the final attack. Machine gun positions were reinforced, sniper teams were rotated to maintain constant pressure, and mortar crews adjusted their aim based on observed hits and near misses. Chen's radio equipment had taken shrapnel damage during the latest mortar barrage, limiting their ability to communicate with the outside world. The psychological impact of losing their connection to friendly forces was as significant as the tactical disadvantage. They were now truly alone, cut off from any hope of rescue or reinforcement. As the afternoon wore on, ammunition shortages became critical. Morrison implemented strict fire discipline, requiring his men to make every shot count. They could no longer afford suppressive fire or hasty shots at questionable targets. Each bullet had to find its mark, or their defensive capabilities would collapse entirely. The first serious breach attempt came at the compound's northern wall. Enemy sappers had managed to place explosive charges against the base of the wall during the previous night, and the afternoon assault was timed to coincide with the detonation of these charges. The explosion created a gap large enough for assault troops to enter, but Williams's accurate rifle fire prevented them from exploiting the breach. Rodriguez volunteered for the dangerous mission of sealing the breach with his remaining explosives. Crawling through debris-filled rooms while under constant fire, he managed to reach the damaged wall and position charges that would collapse additional masonry to block the opening. The explosion succeeded in sealing the breach, but it also revealed their location to enemy mortar crews. The compound's water supply had been contaminated by debris from the constant bombardment, forcing the team to rely on their individual water supplies. Dehydration was becoming a serious concern as temperatures soared and physical exertion continued. Morrison knew that their combat effectiveness would decline rapidly once heat exhaustion set in. Williams reported increasing enemy activity on all sides of the compound. Fresh fighters were arriving hourly, and heavy weapons were being moved into position for what appeared to be a final assault. Through his scope, he could see enemy commanders coordinating their forces and positioning equipment for maximum effect. The end was approaching rapidly. Morrison made the decision to consolidate his team's defensive positions in the compound's main building. The stone construction offered better protection than the outer walls, and concentrated firepower might allow them to hold out longer against the final assault. Moving his wounded teammates to the new positions required exposed movement across the courtyard, but there were no alternatives left. Chen managed to repair his radio equipment enough to send one final message to headquarters. His transmission was brief and to the point. 8 American operators surrounded and outnumbered, ammunition critically low, no hope of escape or rescue. He requested that their families be notified of their situation and their commitment to fight to the end rather than surrender to enemy forces. The enemy's loudspeaker messages had evolved throughout the day, moving from propaganda to specific threats against the SEALs and their families. Intelligence gathered from previous operations allowed the Taliban commanders to mention details about the operators' personal lives, creating additional psychological pressure. The messages revealed that the enemy had been planning this operation for months and had detailed knowledge of American special operations procedures. As shadows began to lengthen across the compound, Morrison realized that they had perhaps 2 hours of daylight remaining. The enemy would almost certainly launch their final assault under cover of darkness, using their numerical superiority and intimate knowledge of the terrain to overrun the weakened American positions. His team had fought bravely and professionally, but mathematics and logistics were working against them. Williams had identified what appeared to be the enemy command position on a ridge approximately 800 meters north of the compound. Through his scope, he could see officers coordinating the assault preparations and directing the positioning of heavy weapons. The distance was at the extreme range of his rifle, but eliminating the enemy commanders might disrupt their attack long enough to give his team additional time. Rodriguez began preparing his final surprises for the enemy assault. His remaining explosives were configured as anti-personnel devices that would detonate when the compound's doors were breached. The charges wouldn't stop the assault, but they might inflict enough casualties to slow the enemy advance and give his teammates additional fighting time. Morrison checked his men's ammunition one final time and redistributed supplies to ensure that each position could maintain fire for as long as possible. The mathematics were grim. They had perhaps 30 minutes of sustained combat before their ammunition was exhausted. After that, they would be reduced to fighting with knives, grenades, and whatever improvised weapons they could create. As the sun continued its descent toward the western peaks, Morrison reflected on the mission that had brought them to this desperate situation. They had followed their orders, executed their assigned tasks, and maintained their honor even in the face of certain death. Whatever happened in the coming hours, they would meet their fate as warriors and brothers. When death seemed certain, the sun hung low over the Afghan mountains, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward the besieged compound like fingers of death. Morrison knew that darkness would bring the final enemy assault, and his team's ammunition was nearly exhausted. Williams had 3 magazines remaining, Chen had 2, and Rodriguez was down to his sidearm and a handful of grenades. Their water was gone, their radio was damaged, and hope was fading with the daylight. The enemy commanders had grown bold in their certainty of victory. Through binoculars, Morrison could see them moving openly on the ridgelines, directing their fighters into assault positions without concern for American return fire. They knew the SEALs were nearly finished, and they were savoring their approaching triumph over the elite American warriors who had caused them so much trouble in previous operations. Williams had taken up a final defensive position in the compound's highest room, where a small window provided a view of the northern approach route. His rifle was clean and ready, but his hands trembled slightly from exhaustion and dehydration. He had been fighting continuously for over 8 hours, and his body was reaching the limits of human endurance. Still, his scope was steady as he searched for priority targets among the enemy forces. Rodriguez had completed his preparations for the final stand. Every entrance to their defensive position was rigged with his remaining explosives, timed to detonate when the first enemy fighters breached the doors. He had also prepared improvised incendiary devices from the compound's fuel supplies, hoping to create enough chaos and casualties to slow the assault. His explosives expertise might buy them a few additional minutes of life. Chen continued working with his damaged radio, trying to establish one final communication with friendly forces. The equipment sparked and smoked from shrapnel damage, but he refused to abandon the hope that someone might hear their final transmission. His fingers were bloody from working with the broken components, but he persisted in his efforts to call for help that he knew would never come. The enemy's psychological warfare reached new levels of cruelty as their assault preparations neared completion. Loudspeakers broadcast recorded screams and pleas from previous American prisoners, mixed with threats and promises of slow death for the trapped SEALs. The messages were designed to break their will during these final hours, but the elite operators had been trained to resist such tactics. Morrison gathered his men in the compound's central room, for what he believed would be their final conversation as living soldiers. Each man knew that capture was not an option. They had seen what happened to American prisoners in enemy hands, and they were prepared to fight until their ammunition was exhausted and then use their final grenades on themselves rather than face torture and public execution. The weight of command had never felt heavier on Morrison's shoulders. These men had followed him into this trap because of faulty intelligence and enemy cunning that were beyond anyone's control. Now they would die because of circumstances that no amount of training or courage could overcome. He looked at each face, memorizing the features of men who had become closer than brothers through shared danger and mutual trust. Williams reported movement in all sectors as enemy assault teams moved into their final positions. He counted at least 60 fighters visible from his vantage point, with more certainly hidden in the rocks and shadows. Heavy machine guns were being positioned to provide covering fire for the assault, and mortar crews were making final adjustments to their weapons. The attack would come from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming the SEAL's ability to respond effectively. Chen managed to establish brief radio contact with a distant American aircraft, but the connection was too weak and intermittent for effective communication. Fragments of his transmission might have been received, but he had no way of knowing whether anyone understood their desperate situation. The radio finally died completely, its circuits destroyed by accumulated damage from the day-long bombardment. The enemy's confidence was evident in their casual preparations. Fighters moved openly between positions. Officers gave orders without concealment, and heavy weapons were positioned with deliberate precision. They had calculated the Americans' remaining ammunition, supplies, and were certain that organized resistance would collapse within minutes of the assault's beginning. Rodriguez checked his improvised defensive measures one final time. The explosive charges were properly positioned and armed, the incendiary devices were ready for deployment, and his personal weapons were clean and loaded. He had never expected to die in a mud brick compound thousands of miles from home, but he was prepared to make his death as expensive as possible for the enemy. Morrison made his final tactical assessment of their situation. The compound offered excellent fields of fire in all directions, but they lacked the manpower and ammunition to take advantage of these positions. The enemy's numerical superiority would allow them to attack simultaneously from multiple directions, dividing the SEALs' attention and firepower until their defense collapsed. The psychological pressure was immense as the final minutes ticked away. Each man dealt with the approaching certainty of death in his own way. Williams focused on his rifle scope, searching for targets among the enemy forces. Chen continued trying to repair his radio equipment despite its obvious destruction. Rodriguez methodically checked and rechecked his explosive devices. Morrison reviewed their tactical options one final time, hoping to find some possibility he had previously overlooked. Williams noticed unusual activity on the northern ridge that he couldn't immediately identify. Through his scope, he could see enemy fighters pointing toward something beyond his field of view, and their body language suggested excitement, rather than the calm confidence they had displayed throughout the day. He adjusted his position to get a better view, wondering if reinforcements were arriving to join the already overwhelming enemy force. The first enemy probe came just as the sun touched the mountain peaks to the west. A small group of fighters approached the compound's eastern wall, testing the Americans' remaining firepower and reaction times. Williams engaged them with precise rifle fire, forcing them back, but the exchange revealed his position to enemy snipers and consumed precious ammunition. Rodriguez detonated one of his perimeter charges as enemy sappers attempted to place explosives against the compound's main gate. The explosion killed several fighters and damaged their equipment, but it also alerted the enemy commanders that the Americans still possessed some defensive capabilities. The final assault would be adjusted to account for the remaining American resistance. Chen thought he heard something unusual in the static from his dead radio equipment, but he couldn't be sure whether it was real communication or wishful thinking, brought on by exhaustion and desperation. The sound was too faint and distorted to understand, but it seemed different from the random electronic noise that had filled his earpiece since the radio's destruction. Morrison ordered his men to conserve their ammunition for the final assault while maintaining the appearance of active resistance. Each shot had to count, and they could no longer afford warning shots or suppressive fire. When the enemy attack began, they would have perhaps 10 minutes of organized resistance before their ammunition was exhausted and they would be reduced to fighting with knives and bare hands. As darkness began to settle over the mountains, Morrison realized that this would be his team's final stand. They had fought bravely and professionally, but the mathematics of warfare were working against them. Superior numbers, unlimited ammunition, and intimate knowledge of the terrain had given the enemy advantages that no amount of courage could overcome. In minutes, the final battle would begin. The Silent Guardian. The first enemy assault began just as darkness settled over the mountains. Muzzle flashes erupted from a dozen positions simultaneously, creating a deadly light show that illuminated the compound's walls with stroboscopic intensity. Morrison pressed himself against the stone wall, feeling bullets impact inches from his head as he tried to coordinate his team's final defense. This was it, the moment they had been dreading all day. Williams engaged the assault teams from his elevated position, his rifle cracking with mechanical precision as he selected targets among the advancing fighters. Each shot found its mark, but there were too many enemies and too few bullets. He watched through his scope as fighters he had wounded were immediately replaced by fresh attackers, their numbers seemingly endless in the gathering darkness. Rodriguez triggered his first perimeter explosive as enemy fighters breached the compound's outer gate. The blast sent bodies flying and created a momentary pause in the assault, but the respite lasted only seconds before new waves of attackers pressed forward over the bodies of their fallen comrades. His carefully planned defensive measures were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers and determination. Chen had given up on his radio and taken up his rifle, adding his firepower to the desperate defense. From his position near the compound's eastern wall, he could see enemy fighters scaling the walls with ropes and grappling hooks, their silhouettes clearly visible against the starlit sky. His marksmanship was less precise than Williams', but every shot still counted in their fight for survival. The enemy's assault was methodical and coordinated despite its intensity. While assault teams pressed forward against the compound's main defenses, other fighters moved to flank their positions and cut off any possible escape routes. Machine gun fire swept the compound's courtyard, making movement between positions impossible and isolating each defender in his fighting position. Morrison realized that their organized defense was collapsing faster than he had anticipated. The enemy's numerical superiority was overwhelming their ability to respond effectively, and their ammunition was disappearing at an alarming rate. Williams had one magazine remaining, Rodriguez was down to his sidearm, and Chen was firing single shots to conserve his final rounds. The psychological impact of the approaching defeat was as dangerous as the physical threat. Combat fatigue, dehydration, and the certainty of death were affecting the team's reaction times and decision-making abilities. Morrison could see the strain on his men's faces as they realized that their final moments were approaching rapidly. Still, they continued fighting with the professionalism that had made them elite warriors. Williams noticed something unusual happening on the northern ridge that he couldn't immediately explain. Enemy fighters who had been confidently directing the assault were suddenly taking cover, and their aggressive advance seemed to be faltering for reasons that had nothing to do with American resistance. Through his scope, he could see confusion and alarm spreading among the enemy forces, but he couldn't identify the cause of their sudden concern. The sound came from somewhere in the darkness beyond the compound, a sharp crack that was distinctly different from the chaos of automatic weapons fire and explosions. Williams had heard that sound before, the report of a precision rifle fired from extreme range. Someone was shooting at the enemy forces from a position far outside the battle area, but the identity and location of this mysterious marksman remained unknown. Rodriguez paused in his reloading to listen more carefully to the sounds of battle. The enemy's assault rhythm was changing in subtle ways that his combat experience helped him recognize. Fighters who had been advancing with confidence were now moving more cautiously, and their coordinated attacks were becoming disorganized as individual units reacted to threats from unexpected directions. Chen noticed that the enemy's machine gun fire, which had been sweeping the compound systematically, was becoming sporadic and unfocused. The heavy weapons that had been suppressing their defensive positions were no longer maintaining sustained fire, and some had gone silent entirely. Something was happening outside their field of view that was affecting the enemy's ability to coordinate their assault. Morrison tried to make sense of the changing tactical situation while continuing to direct his team's defense. The enemy assault was continuing, but with noticeably less intensity and coordination than before. Fighters were still approaching their positions, but they seemed distracted and uncertain, constantly looking over their shoulders toward the surrounding ridgelines. Williams heard the distinctive crack of the long-range rifle again, followed immediately by the screams of wounded enemy fighters somewhere in the darkness. The mysterious marksman was systematically engaging high-value targets among the enemy forces, and his accuracy was having a significant impact on their assault operations. Officers and machine gun crews seemed to be his primary focus. The enemy's loudspeaker propaganda had stopped completely, replaced by urgent radio communications in local dialects that Williams couldn't understand but recognized as coordination attempts between scattered units. The confidence and arrogance that had characterized their earlier transmissions had been replaced by confusion and growing alarm. Rodriguez felt a spark of hope for the first time in hours as he realized that someone was fighting on their behalf from the surrounding mountains. The identity of their mysterious ally remained unknown, but his intervention was creating opportunities for survival that had seemed impossible just minutes before. The mathematical certainty of their deaths was being challenged by this unexpected development. Chen managed to spot muzzle flashes from the mysterious sniper's position on a ridge nearly 1,000 meters away. The distance was extreme for accurate rifle fire, but the marksman's shots were finding their targets with deadly precision. Enemy commanders and heavy weapons crews were being eliminated one by one, disrupting the coordination and firepower of the assault. Morrison made the tactical decision to take advantage of the enemy's confusion by launching a limited counterattack against their nearest positions. With Rodriguez providing explosive support and Williams covering their advance, they might be able to break out of the compound and establish contact with their mysterious ally. The plan was desperate and dangerous, but their current situation offered no better alternatives. The enemy's assault began to falter as their leadership structure collapsed under the precise fire from the unknown sniper. Without effective coordination, individual fighters began to retreat toward positions they considered safer, abandoning the aggressive tactics that had brought them so close to victory. The tide of battle was shifting in ways that none of them had anticipated. Williams tried to establish visual contact with the sniper who had saved their lives, but the distance and darkness made identification impossible. Through his scope, he could see the muzzle flashes from each shot, but the shooter's position was too well concealed for detailed observation. Whoever this person was, he possessed skills that rivaled the best military marksman in the world. As the enemy's coordinated assault deteriorated into scattered, disorganized attacks, Morrison realized that they had been given an unexpected opportunity for survival. Their ammunition was still critically low, their physical condition was deteriorating, and they remained outnumbered by overwhelming odds. But the mysterious sniper had disrupted the enemy's plans enough to give them hope for the first time since the battle began. The question now was whether they could take advantage of this opportunity before the enemy recovered from their confusion and adapted to the new threat. Morrison knew that their window of opportunity would be brief, and any chance for survival would require immediate action and perfect coordination among his exhausted team members. Salvation from the shadows. The mysterious sniper continued his deadly work with methodical precision, each shot carefully calculated to maximum effect on the enemy's command structure. Williams watched through his scope as Taliban officers fell one by one, their deaths creating chaos among the fighters who had been so confident of victory just minutes before. The sound of that distant rifle had become the most beautiful music the trapped SEALs had ever heard. Morrison seized the moment of enemy confusion to organize a breakout attempt. With Rodriguez providing explosive cover and Williams maintaining overwatch fire, they had a narrow window of opportunity to escape the compound that had become their prison. The plan was desperate and carried enormous risks, but remaining in their current position would only delay their inevitable deaths. Chen gathered the team's remaining equipment while keeping watch on the eastern approaches. The enemy fighters in that sector had pulled back after losing their machine gun crew to the sniper's accurate fire, but they were already beginning to reorganize under new leadership. The window of opportunity would close quickly as the Taliban adapted to this unexpected threat from the surrounding mountains. Rodriguez triggered his final explosive charges to create breaches in the compound's western wall. The blasts opened gaps large enough for the team to move through, while simultaneously creating smoke and dust that would conceal their initial movements. His demolitions expertise had served them well throughout the siege. and now it might provide their path to freedom. Williams maintained suppressive fire against the nearest enemy positions, while his teammates prepared for the breakout. His ammunition was nearly exhausted, but each shot forced enemy fighters to keep their heads down during the critical moments when his team was most vulnerable. The mysterious sniper continued engaging targets on the distant ridgelines, keeping pressure on the enemy's command elements. The breakout began with Rodriguez leading the way through the breach he had created in the western wall. Morrison followed immediately behind, with Chen providing rear security as they moved toward the rocky terrain that might offer concealment from enemy observation. Williams would follow last after expending his remaining ammunition and covering fire. The mysterious sniper seemed to anticipate their movement, shifting his fire to suppress enemy positions that threatened their escape route. His shots eliminated a machine gun crew that had been repositioning to intercept their retreat, and his continued pressure on the enemy commanders prevented them from coordinating an effective response to the American breakout. Morrison led his team through the treacherous mountain terrain, using every available piece of cover to conceal their movement from enemy observation. The rocky outcroppings and scattered boulders provided protection from direct fire, but they also limited visibility and made navigation difficult in the darkness. Each step had to be calculated to avoid areas where enemy fighters might be waiting in ambush. Chen maintained rear security as they moved, watching for signs of enemy pursuit, while staying in communication with his teammates through hand signals. The Taliban fighters were still reeling from the sniper's devastating attacks on their leadership, but they were beginning to recover and organize search parties to locate the escaped Americans. Rodriguez used his knowledge of explosives to identify and avoid potential ambush sites where the enemy might have placed improvised devices. His expertise in demolitions also helped him recognize natural choke points, where enemy fighters would be most likely to position themselves for maximum effectiveness against escaping personnel. Williams had exhausted his rifle ammunition but continued to provide security with his sidearm as the team moved toward higher ground. The mysterious sniper's fire had decreased in frequency, suggesting either that he was running low on ammunition or that he was repositioning to maintain effective coverage of their escape route. The team's movement was painfully slow due to their exhausted condition and the need for absolute stealth. Dehydration, heat exhaustion, and the accumulated stress of the day-long battle had pushed them to the limits of human endurance. Each step required tremendous effort, but they continued moving because stopping meant certain death or capture. Morrison spotted movement ahead that caused him to halt the team's advance. Through the darkness, he could see a lone figure positioned among the rocks approximately 200 meters away. The person appeared to be armed with a long-range rifle and was facing away from their position toward the compound they had just escaped. This had to be their mysterious savior. The sniper was a tall, lean figure dressed in local clothing that allowed him to blend perfectly with the mountain environment. His rifle was a high-end precision weapon equipped with advanced optics, and his shooting position was expertly chosen to provide maximum coverage of the battlefield, while offering concealment from enemy observation. Everything about his setup indicated professional military training of the highest caliber. Chen moved forward carefully to establish contact with the mysterious marksman, using tactical hand signals that would be recognized by any military-trained individual. The sniper responded immediately with appropriate counter-signals, confirming that he was indeed a professional soldier or had received extensive military training. The sniper turned to face them, and Morrison was shocked to recognize the weathered face of Master Chief Petty Officer Jake "Ghost" Patterson, a legendary SEAL sniper who had been reported missing in action 3 months earlier during a classified operation in the same region. Patterson had been presumed dead after his team was overrun, but he had somehow survived and remained in the area. Patterson's story emerged in whispered conversations as they continued their escape toward safer terrain. He had been the sole survivor of his team's ambush, wounded and left for dead by enemy fighters who believed he was dying. He had recovered slowly in a cave system known only to local shepherds, nursed back to health by an elderly Afghan man who hated the Taliban for killing his sons. For 3 months, Patterson had lived in the mountains like a ghost, observing enemy movements and planning his revenge against the fighters who had killed his teammates. His intimate knowledge of the terrain and the enemy's patterns had made him the perfect guardian angel for Morrison's trapped team. He had been watching their situation develop throughout the day, waiting for the perfect moment to intervene. Patterson's intervention had been precisely timed to create maximum disruption of the enemy's assault while providing the trapped SEALs with their best opportunity for escape. His selection of targets had been methodical and devastating, eliminating key leaders and weapons crews in a sequence designed to collapse the enemy's command structure and coordination abilities. The combined team continued their escape through terrain that Patterson knew intimately. His months of survival in these mountains had given him knowledge of cave systems, water sources, and hidden paths that would allow them to evade enemy search parties while making their way toward friendly territory. His local contacts could provide assistance and concealment during their journey. As dawn approached, they reached a secure position where Patterson had established a cache of supplies and equipment. Food, water, medical supplies, and ammunition were available to restore their strength and capabilities. A hidden radio allowed Patterson to establish contact with American forces and coordinate their extraction from the hostile territory. Morrison looked at his exhausted teammates and realized that they had experienced something extraordinary. They had faced certain death with courage and professionalism, but they had also been saved by the intervention of a warrior who had risen from the dead to protect his brothers in arms. Patterson's skills and dedication had transformed their desperate last stand into a story of survival and brotherhood. The rescue helicopter arrived just as the sun cleared the eastern mountains, its crew guided by Patterson's precise coordinates and intimate knowledge of safe landing zones. As they lifted off from the hostile terrain, Morrison reflected on the lessons of their ordeal, the importance of never giving up hope, the power of brotherhood among warriors, and the mysterious ways that salvation sometimes arrives from the most unexpected sources.